Oh, hi, Sharon.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
Good.
Good. Hey, Robin.
Hey, Sharon, how are you? Peter?
Good. You?
Good.
Good. Good.
Hope everybody had a nice holiday.
A nice quiet holiday, yeah.
Yeah. That's sometimes a real plus.
So this is Sally Wallace, who's joined us. She's one of our congregation members.
Okay, great. Hi,
Interested,
Sally, how are you?
I hate to think how many decades ago it was when I first met Sally.
Okay. Okay. Well, Sally is the longest serving member of our congregation at like 50, 51 years.
Wow.
Yeah. Hey, Michael.
It's a landmark.
Everyone.
So are we expecting anybody else, Sharon, do you think?
Yeah, we're expecting Paul Craig, our treasurer.
Okay.
And Karen White was going to join us, but she is ill. And our minister, Jack Donovan, was going to join us. So,
Okay.
yeah, so I guess we can wait a few moments.
Hi, Sally.
No sound for Sally.
Oh.
So Michael, this is Robin Reed with Preserve the Berg.
Hi, Robin.
And Peter
Hi,
Belmont,
Michael.
Preserve the Berg. And so Peter, are you like the executive director now, or you just have this Zoom session?
I always forget to change that. It's the Preserve the Berg Zoom, whatever you want to say. It's our Zoom account. And unless you change the name, it comes up automatically as executive director.
Right.
Cool. Sally, do you have sound? Can you hear? No?
Become part of a historic district, right? Michael's in Kenwood.
Right.
Oh,
Are you-
excellent.
We call it hysterical Kenwood.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm in the I think the most recent quadrant.
The one that's pending or the one that was last adopted? I mean, there's one that's pending that they act like it's in place, but it's still,
Okay.
I think it's going to be scheduled in February.
Borders 5th Avenue, 26th, I guess, to 28th. That quadrant. I was a block captain. Are we pending? I thought it passed. Are we pending?
No, I think that one is passed, and there's one
Yeah, that's
more
what I
that
thought.
is pending.
That's what I thought. So I think interesting strategy to break it up that way by neighborhood, but it was pretty easy. I didn't do the heavy lifting. I was just a block captain. So
Oh, good for you.
I mean, I can say that I think kind of Brenda started a lot of it, but I think the neighborhood's done a great job of kind of organizing, with the block captain type idea and everything in terms of kind of, in part, spreading the workload around a little bit and making sure there were people there to keep it moving.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Sharon, you've done a nice job of introducing everybody, which we were going to do anyway. I thank you for that. And just to let everyone know that how much we appreciate the opportunity to share some of the knowledge that particularly Peter has gained over the years about historic designation and historic districts. So with that, I will just, Peter, would you like to give sort of a brief introduction, and then maybe we can have some questions from people?
Sure. I think from our perspective, it seems like the Mirror Lake, I oftentimes say the Mirror Lake neighborhood is how I reference it. I have always felt that downtown is composed of a variety of neighborhoods within the downtown, and it's really not necessarily one neighborhood. So as far as the Mirror Lake neighborhood, it's been on our radar screen for a fair number of years, I think we have discussions about talking about potential district designation that easily go back 4 or 5 years. And I think we've seen varying levels of interest from the city. We're kind of pleased that there seems to be some renewed interest at this point. And I think our interest in looking at potential district designation is that we've viewed the Mirror Lake portion of downtown as probably today comprising the greatest concentration of historic structures. As you all are kind of well aware, it's I think a great kind of assortment in the sense of those structures range from, small bungalows to the larger buildings, including your church and some of the, recreational buildings that are part of the Mirror Lake Recreation Complex in the Shuffleboard Court area, and obviously the school district buildings. So it's a great combination, as well as a great concentration of what's left of old St. Pete. So I think in parts of Mirror Lake, you can still get the feel of really 1920s St. Petersburg. And so it differs from a lot of the rest of downtown because it still retains, I think, that feel and that sense of place. And so the question then is, will it in the future? And for those who desire it to retain some of that character, what's the best way of going about it? I think our conclusion has been that district designation would be a key to that. And it would be a key in part because it is, from the zoning perspective, a part of downtown. And so downtown, in large part from the zoning perspective, is one place. And from the zoning perspective, that means relatively intense development is allowed anywhere in downtown. And we have argued in the past that even though zoning allows intense development, zoning approvals on a case-by-case basis should still be balanced over or against what is surrounding it. In large part, that interpretation has been rejected by the city. And so downtown zoning does not do an adequate job of retaining the character that the Mirror Lake neighborhood has. So we just view district designation as a tool that better allows the neighborhood, better allows the city to fit future development to our present kind of character and our present kind of special features that make it a unique neighborhood. So that's kind of a bit of background, or if you want to say reasoning, to how we've come to the perspective that we have, that a district designation would be very beneficial for the Mirror Lake part of downtown. So we don't view it as necessarily a hindrance to kind of future changes and future development. We just view it as something that brings about better future development and redevelopment. There are two ways that a neighborhood can become designated as a district. One is the way that Kenwood has been doing so far, which is the kind of neighborhood initiated application. And that requires the neighborhood vote, the city issued ballot and the neighborhood vote. Part of that neighborhood vote is the quirk that all property owners are counted in that vote. So even though the requirement is only for a simple majority to allow the designation process to move forward, in fact, it's a much higher proportion in reality, because if a property owner does not return a ballot, which happens in a significant number of cases, that property will be counted automatically as a no vote. So that's one process that could be gone through. We have concerns that it would be difficult to get that majority vote in view of the problems with the non-responding owners and others who may be opposed. The alternative way under the city process for a neighborhood to become a district is city initiation. City initiation is where formally the city would be the applicant, and where the city is an applicant, a property owner vote is not required. So that piece of that process would not take place if the city moves forward with the application itself. It does not mean that the public or the neighborhood would be cut out of the process. There would still be neighborhood meetings. There would still be public hearings before both the Preservation Commission and City Council. But that balloting process itself would not be required or part of the process. So in part because of difficulties with the balloting process, in part because we think why Mirror Lake is a neighborhood unto itself, that downtown is really, you know, a kind of a greater resource for St. Pete, that it's very appropriate for the city to be the applicant for the Mirror Lake neighborhood, or that matter for any downtown section or piece. So Preserve the Burg has been talking with council members, trying to gauge interest and trying to encourage council members to consider initiating the downtown application. And where we stand today is council member Gina Driscoll has said that she is ready to start that process, and starting that process means that she would bring it before City Council, put it on the City Council agenda so that City Council could either refer the matter to a council subcommittee for further discussion, or potentially refer it to the Preservation Commission for further discussion. And through the course of further discussion, again, we would expect there to be more neighborhood outreach, as well as a recommendation ultimately coming back to City Council to determine if the application will go forward. So that's where we kind of stand today. Gina had initially set the matter for the last City Council meeting this past month, or this month in December. It got deferred. We believe it's going to go on council again in January, but that has not been finalized. So that's kind of where we stand today. And I'm happy to stop here and kind of answer questions, or if there's particular parts of the process you'd like me to further talk about or explain, I'm happy to do that.
This is very helpful, Peter, because I wasn't aware that there was not a ballot process, but this city third party initiated is it's a new process for the city.
Right, and it's only been done once before, and I'm going to say the once before is kind of it's a strange story. The only time the city has done it before is for first block downtown, so another piece of downtown. That was started at the end of the Baker administration. It was pushed by Jeff Danner, who was a council member at the time, and it was kind of one of the things he did as he was going out of office, brought it up to council. Once Bill Foster became mayor, it kind of got shoved onto the back burner. And so between the time the city initiated it and the time it actually came before the Preservation Commission and City Council was a multi-year time period. It was eventually denied on a 4-4 City Council vote. Immediately after that meeting, one of the council members indicated that she desired to change her vote. One of the no votes indicated she desired to change her vote to a yes vote. And there was some discussion whether they could move to reconsider. The city attorney's office said no, they could not. And that is several years ago now. And again, there's some potential discussion about that coming back. But that's the only other instance where the city has undertaken initiating a district application.
So could you tell us about what it means for the church, and a little bit about the certificate of appropriateness and that sort of thing? Because I think that's what some of our folks are going to be interested in, who might be generally supportive of the concept, but what does it mean for a property owner?
All right, the first, I guess the first distinction I always note is that as far as review that would ensue if there were going to be changes made to the property, first of all, it's going to be looking at exterior changes, not interior changes. So if there was going to be kind of interior remodeling, that would not be something that comes under the city's kind of landmark review process. Otherwise, if we're talking about the exterior, if there were going to be alterations to the exterior of the building, if there were going to be additions, or if there were going to be demolitions of, you know, part of the buildings, all of that would be subject to review under the designation process. If it's going to be alterations, the city has a what they refer to as a matrix, and that matrix means that they have a list of types of changes, and the purpose of that matrix is to say if you have X type of change, that only requires staff review. If you have Y type of change, a more significant type of change potentially to the exterior features of the building, then that requires Preservation Commission review, not just staff review. And so there would be a public hearing involved with commission review. The general idea, I think, is that the process is encouraging significant features, architectural features that are historical features of the building to be retained and reused. And if there's going to be new construction, that it generally fit in scale-wise with the existing historic buildings on your particular piece of property. I don't think it necessarily says you have to do X, Y, Z style, but it needs to generally fit in with what is around it. And so, again, the review process is set up to encourage that to happen. So it's referred to by the acronym COA, which stands for Certificate of Appropriateness. And that simply means that's the name of the review process, so that if the church was going to make exterior changes, they would need to get the COA. And as I said, depending upon the nature of the change, it would either go simply for staff approval or potentially for full commission approval. In large part, I think with that process in place, that what we have seen so far in experience has been, I think, pretty successful. It's the vast majority of applications have been approved. I think typically a property owner understands then that they're going to be part of that process, and so professionals who might be involved, whether it be a contractor, architect, are going to obviously attempt to produce or create a product that will be acceptable. And so again, with this COA process in place, it just encourages greater thought to maintaining those features that make your building special, and discourage your either doing away with them or adding something that doesn't fit in with them. So Sharon, I don't know if you want to add to that. Sharon obviously has a great deal of experience and she's on the commission, but that's my basic explanation. So as you might change, aspects of your buildings in the future, I would expect that you potentially would be involved with the COA process. At least my own opinion would be that should not be a hindrance to accomplishing the goals that you would want to achieve or desire in the future. Just before we got on the phone, I started to take a very quick look at your master plan on the website. Didn't quite have enough time to really get through it very well, but again, I would think that ideas that you've talked about would be ideas that would not be come in conflict with the district process or the COA process. and clearly you have been sensitive over time that you own and have an historic resource, and it's a resource that you desire to maintain. So I think the goals that you have as guardians of your church property and the goals that the city might have through the review process are pretty much hand in hand and in line with one another. Go ahead.
You're muted.
Yeah, you're on mute.
So tired of hearing that. I don't know what we're going to do post-COVID. I got a bumper sticker saying you're on mute. Thank you for this. A couple of questions, and I sort of get confused because we went through this process. We lived in Washington D.C. before this, and I know, and I seem to recall that like sometimes there's a process where you take an inventory, and I don't know, would the city pay? Is that part of the city process, or would the city pay for doing that inventory, or would everything just be automatically included? That's part one, and then I also have some questions because, and maybe it's, I don't know what the rules are here. Maybe it's different, but I seem to recall from prior experience that churches fell under kind of different guidelines or rules in terms of what they could or couldn't do or choose to opt in or opt out because of their religious standing as institutions. But then on the other hand, I seem to recall that like there are cases where there might be some kind of funding available, like if you were to take it to the next level and take your property and put it on the national register, that it could open up some opportunities for outside funding to make some repairs. I'm thinking like our roof, for example, was originally a tile roof. It's now a shingle roof, and so I don't know. I'm assuming that when it's time to replace that roof, which I think is like 10 years away now, that we would either be encouraged or required to put on the tile roof, or I don't know, maybe we would want to do solar, and which some UU congregations are doing, and like, just curious, like how we might be impacted in the future if we were to I mean, that's something that is very much in our timeline. One example I can think of.
Right.
But I'm also trying to understand, because I for some reason I'm thinking that churches are treated a little differently just because the whole church state thing. And
right. And there may not be a simple answer to that. My response would be right now is that St. Pete is not treating the church properties differently. There are at times issues that get raised based upon federal legislation about kind of treatment of church property. The city, I think in general, is not, I'm going to say, as restrictive, or you can pick your term, restrictive, conservative, tight, as many other jurisdictions are when you're talking about review for changes to locally designated buildings. I will also say that the city uses what is referred to as the Secretary of the Interior standards or guidelines. Secretary of the Interior refers to the Federal Department of the Interior, which oversees the National Register. And so they have a set of guidelines that were created, I think, several decades ago, that are commonly used by professionals for review of changes to historic buildings. The city has essentially adopted those by reference, so they consider those guidelines when they look at applications. Generally, I would say you're not going to be required to put back something that isn't there. And so I'm going to use your roof example. So if you have a building that today does not have the historic roof on it in terms of material, the city is not going to say your only option is to, go back and put on a material that is historic that is not presently there. In terms of, if you want to say grant funding opportunities, I'm going to say they're pretty limited. I think being historic opens up at least some possibilities that wouldn't be there. The city has a fairly substantial but limited geographically funding program for historic properties, which is supposed to be a 5-year program. Year one was 2019. 2020 has never really happened. I'm waiting for it to come out again. And when I say it was pretty limited geographically, it was limited to properties within the in-town redevelopment area. I would need to double check. I don't know if you know, Sharon, I don't think the church is within that boundary, but it kind of zigzags around part of downtown. So like I said, I would have to double check to see whether or not the church is actually in or out of those boundaries.
Is that the CR?
Yeah, it's a CRA.
Nothing to do with that.
And
CRA. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And so it was going to be, I think, over 5 years, a $5 million kind of grant program that was actually for, if you want to say exactly what you were talking about, I mean, it was for historic buildings within the boundaries of the CRA to make improvements and maintenance and things of that nature. If you're within the CRA, then that would be a great program whenever the city kind of kicks it in gear again. And it would be a great program over the next supposed 5 years, because that area is supposed to expire. And so part of the reason why it was a 5-year program was that was, I believe, the duration of that CRA.
Yeah, I just looked at the map. I think we're in it. It goes up to 2nd Avenue North. So
okay.
Well, the thing is, we're right on the other side of 2nd Avenue North.
Well,
that's Burlington.
Like I said, it zigzags around quite a bit. So
yeah, it does, because at one place it goes up to 5th Avenue North. Oh, wait a minute. No, I see no, we're not in it. We're definitely not in it. It just goes to 5th Avenue South in our part of town. So
there is, and I don't remember the exact name of it off the top of my head. There's another funding program that's kind of a joint program with the National Trust and another organization that's focused on churches.
The American Express, yeah, our church in DC got $50,000 from American Express Foundation for the bell tower.
Okay, and I'm not sure, actually, what I'm thinking of, I'm not sure it's the American Express thing, and I mean, I have something I can send you, but again, it was, focused on churches.
That would be great. I would love to.
And I think the idea on that was, if I kind of recall correctly, it was, kind of congregations, again, that obviously had a need, and recognizing that churches are closing as far as church use, and trying to avoid that, and provide funding to help keep congregations using their buildings.
For sacred places. That thing. Yeah.
I think it's Partners for Sacred Places.
But yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yes.
Yeah. That's they do fantastic work.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, thank you. I don't want to derail, but that's I if I'm just, obviously if there are financial incentives, I mean, not property tax wouldn't apply to us, but yeah, that would be something that.
Right. And that's one of the other, if you want to say problems for a church in terms of incentives, that, there are a couple other, tax incentives, but they're not going to, really help you. I will say that if you were, involved in probably somewhat major projects that if you are, on the National Register, there is that tax credit can be kind of sold. So even though that tax credit may not,
Like-
be able to
like
be
trans-
used directly by the church, it could
Right.
be kind of sold.
Transfer development rights, is that what you're talking about? TDR?
Well, no, that's another one. But I mean, under the national tax credit is kind of like a 20% tax credit on your renovation cost. The TDR would be potentially available to you. That's a local program. And, now that we've kind of entered into I'm going to say a new boom, that TDR program is finally starting to work. So the city adopted that TDR program quite a number of years ago. For most of its life, it had virtually no utility because there was no demand for it. But there are a number of projects now in terms of the new boom that have been purchasing TDRs. So that is a potential option.
Thank you.
Yeah, looking at our facilities master plan and some ideas that might come to fruition. A lot of the work is on the interior, though there's discussion, and I have no idea when any of this would move forward, of a patio out front with that's just kind of an elevated space that we could use for gatherings, which would require a minor alteration to that little portico so that people can actually go from the building out into the patio. The other one is a new gate entrance on the Arlington side. One thing that would be a question, we're looking at putting in an elevator between the two buildings. And it's an interior courtyard. If you looked really hard, you could see it from the street. And it's the courtyard is kind of covered on, there's barely a space opening to get out. So it's kind of an interior space. I'm assuming something like that wouldn't go through.
I'm going to give you one example, local example. And I think it's probably, it might surprise people that they went through the process. And that is on Beach Drive. Why am I drawing the blank on the name now, Robin?
The Birchwood?
Yeah, the Birchwood. So, the Birchwood has their elevator tower that they added.
Well, and Peter, what about the Palladium? Did the Palladium add that tower after or before?
I think they added that before, I believe.
Oh, okay.
But the Birchwood added the floors on top, added the elevator tower on the side. So, there were a lot of changes to that building that all went through that process. So that's an example, I think, of flexibility to the process.
But windows, at some point we're going to probably have to replace our single pane windows.
And Windows, Sharon can probably address this, but Windows is probably one of the most common questions actually that comes up. And and when Carl Nurse was on City Council, Carl at times I've known Carl for a long time, but I could joke that Carl sometimes wore a hat as kind of being a green person and sometimes other hats. But Carl was concerned when the city last kind of looked at the overall preservation ordinance and updating the ordinance about it limiting or potentially being too limiting on window replacement. And his drive at the time was he didn't want to be in a position where someone could not have a more energy efficient window if they desired it in an historic building. So Carl kind of, if you want to say, pushed through our current kind of language about windows, which I think is an example maybe where we're more flexible than a lot of other jurisdictions. But essentially the idea is that if you have an historic window, you can replace it. You're supposed to replace it so you end up with something that looks akin to the historic window. You don't have to, you're not prohibited from changing your window, potentially changing materials. The primary idea is to kind of, again, retain the opening, the historic size, and look to that window. But there is flexibility. I don't know if you want to add anything to that or not, Sharon, but it's an issue that comes up quite a bit.
Yeah, you know, I want to go back to Michael's question about the inventory, how the decision would be made as to what buildings to include, how far back off the lake to go, because you're probably aware that we have an education building behind the 1929 structure that was actually designed by Bill Harvard, but it's not, I don't think, an exemplary Harvard John building, and that's the building where, I mean, we have a lot on the list, and I don't really anticipate a lot in the way of exterior alterations to that building. But would that building likely be included, because it is within the 50-year? It's 1967.
Right, and I don't.
Or it's outside.
My short answer is I'm not sure, and
Okay.
and the reason why I say that is that typically for each, if you want to say, application, it will end up specifying, I'm going to say, an endpoint to what is significant. So there'll be a time period established, a kind of a time period of significance. And what that means is within a district, you're either going to be labeled, each property will either be labeled as a contributing or non-contributing building or structure to the district. So if you're beyond that kind of time frame of significance, you'll be considered non-contributing. Non-contributing does not exempt that building from review. I think it results in kind of a less height of review. So it's much easier to demolish a non-contributing building, I think, than a contributing building, but the same theory applies to what might replace it. So if you had a non-contributing building and that was going to be demolished, the idea is you still have a review that's going to ensure that something new is within scale of what it should be or what's around it. Likewise, if you're going to be altering that building, you're saying if it's non-contributing, it's kind of typically lacking those historic significant features that you're trying to protect. So it's, again, going to be easier to make changes to it because it doesn't carry that same significance that the contributing structure does. The reason why I say I'm not sure I can answer it is, I mean, I guess there would have to be ultimately a decision made, kind of what is that cutoff year for the Mirror Lake neighborhood for kind of significance, and I'm not sure what the answer is to that yet. I mean, largely you're saying what you're seeking to protect is kind of the 1920s part of the neighborhood, not the kind of post-World War II part of it, in part because I don't think you have that much of that. But I mean, a great example to me would be the apartment building that is behind the old Shoe Law office. Is it Palms of something, I think it's named.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think of that as a nice mid-century apartment building. And so, you know, does that fall within your window of significance or not?
Right, right. Okay.
I mean, those are all, I think, matters that, you know, would need to be discussed and people should, you know, comment on, and ultimately there would need to be a determination made about that.
So any new construction in the district would have to undergo design review so that it essentially worked. And that would include kind of massing and scale. So I assume that there would probably be some kind of height restrictions on new construction. to be respectful to the original scale of the neighborhood?
I think that's a great question. And the reason why I say I think that's a great question is that we, do not have local experience in answering that question. If I had to guess, it would be a factor that would be considered by the city. And if I had to guess, I would say it would not necessarily ban a tall or exceptionally tall building, but it would be a factor that would be at least further considered and thought about as compared to if the district was not in place. It makes me think of a court case out of Tampa, Hyde Park. It was kind of and it was pretty much over height. The developer who wanted the tall building actually won out, but it was a pretty technical argument over the verbiage within their ordinance, and did it allow for height to be considered or not. So I'm not sure that's necessarily applicable to St. Pete, because the language in our ordinance does not match this kind of technical review that was at issue in the court with Tampa. But I answer in part the way I do because I don't think the city's going to say you cannot build a tall building within a downtown district. I just think they're going to say it's something to be considered along with everything else, and will get a little more consideration than without it, because again, without it, much of downtown has no height limit.
Yeah, and I think that's the concern, is because theoretically, somebody could build a 40-story building right on the lake now.
Yep.
And the scale of that, I think some members of our congregation are struggling with the building that went up next to us, which is 6 stories. Personally, I think it's a really well-designed building. And I think as you stand across the lake, it's really quite striking. And so it'll be, I think, a building that stands the test of time, which is what it's all about, isn't it? So, but of course, Lisa Wanamaker's on the commission and she gets all this, So, and we were lucky though. We were lucky with that.
And actually, it's a great point, because if I had guessed, Sharon, a district would highly discourage that 40-story building right on the lake. I think as you go away from the lake, you have a greater chance of being able to do that tall building. But that, that lake frontage is so key to, I think, a district, that it would have more importance there. And again, it's a great example of out that district designation. Again, there would be no height limitation. It's whatever the developer wants to do. The other example I use in that regards is, I think, very out of scale is the proposal for the far side of the lake from you, which has been approved for development, where the old, I always call them the old funky rooming houses across the street from the library exist. I think the building that was approved for there is very out of scale for the neighborhood. City council was told, you don't have the tools in place to further limit it because it's not a district.
Yeah. Well, I think it's that step back, where you kind of gradually increase your height. And I mean, I think we talk about it in Old Northeast some, because that transition from Fifth and then across the street, it's like there's not enough of a buffer where there's kind of stacking of buildings getting progressively higher. So you can go from a 2-story residential to like a monster building in just a couple of blocks. And that's not, I think the city's got to be more attentive to that. So maybe this district, because it's round and there's a lake in the center, would be kind of an obvious opportunity to really think about that.
Yeah, and I think that's partly why I answered the question like I did, that clearly that lake frontage is so sensitive that you're going to step back away from there and maybe allow something bigger the further you get from the lake.
Right.
And again, downtown zoning does not do that.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael,
I can hold off. I can hold off.
Sally, do you have any questions?
Well, I'm just a learner since I haven't been involved in the city politics for 30 years, but I'm here to hear about protection for our church, like the big tall buildings you're talking about. And it seems to me like the historic district ought to have some say in the height and depth of a new construction. But Peter says they don't.
Well, it depends on how the historic district gets written up, right, Peter? I mean, it's because, and that's a process that city staff will drive. But Peter,
yeah, and I'm in part, Sally, I think, answering you what I consider kind of when I say the political answer, I think a realistic answer. So yes, district designation would be a tool in the toolbox to try and ensure that buildings are not too big. I'm not going to tell you that district designation is going to guarantee that. Again, because there is not something within the district guidelines unless they were created for a new district, and they could be, but there isn't anything otherwise that says, buildings over a certain height are prohibited within a historic district. Certainly in many places, each historic district develops their own set of guidelines. And so, and in fact, I know I spoke with Jeff Danner earlier today, and he's talking about Kenwood really needs to do that for Kenwood. But that could be a future option if Mirror Lake became a district, would be to create an individual set of guidelines. And part of what you would address is kind of what we've been talking about, limiting height, particularly along the lakefront properties. The other thing I'll just smile at, Sally, you're saying that you haven't been involved in city politics for 30 years. Somewhat gives a clue to how long it's been since we first got to know one another. It's been a while.
I remember.
Also, I would just add that I think when you're in a district in particular, there's opportunity when someone brings forth a plan and it gets presented that the neighbors can voice their opinion. I mean, we just talked about the house in the historic district of 18th in Old Northeast, and the original architectural plans for that house were really appalling. And the developer described it as, he said, well, it doesn't really have a style. It's kind of a mix of a lot of different things. Well, that was not the concept that was promoted for a historic district. And in the end, a lot of changes were made to that design, and it really was, I would say, hugely improved because people came out and expressed their opinion. There was a lot of conversation. So I think that's also, it's not a guarantee or anything like that, but it's, again, as Peter said, it's another tool that people can use when they're not happy when something is being promoted.
And I don't recall exactly what the vote was on those buildings on the far side of the lake that I referenced. I think it was a split vote. And again, as I indicated, staff told council that, kind of their hands were kind of tied to the extent that it was still a split vote. I think if the district had been in place, that building probably would not have received an approval.
Right.
Well, I would have to agree, because one of the council people who I would normally not expect to be supportive of historic districts actually said, it's really unfortunate today that Mirror Lake is not a district. So, when you have somebody whose background is basically in development and they're talking about the positive aspects of historic districts and controlling something like massive scale, I think that says a lot about having a district, the importance of having a district and the benefits of having a district.
Well, I think we all know too that it has a positive impact on property values, you know, if you've got some cohesion. But I think one advantage, at least for the church, is that, you know, I think there's a neighborhood collaboration thing that happens here. And I think getting to know some of our neighbors and working with them and looking for synergies is always a good thing. And I think, you know, when we surveyed the congregation a couple of years ago before we started this facilities master planning process, and they said our number one physical asset was our location. It's an incredible location, you know, and the second was the historic character of our building. So I think that our congregation recognizes this, but I think it's a real asset for us as far as visibility goes. And I think the more, if there's a historic district and there's some definition given to it with some signage, there's more cohesion, people come to the district. They walk the lake. We've got incredible proximity to so many people that are, you know, living nearby. So I think, well, you know, I'm an advocate here, but.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, if I may, I'm just curious if you know, there's sort of softer cultural benefits, like Sharon just mentioned, that you know, if it's marketing, or if it's driving more traffic, or if in fact we think of ourselves as a civic gathering place that is you know, beyond just kind of our Sunday service component. And, you know, when I think of, like, you know, it's a perfect venue for chamber music, for example, or lectures, or any kind of, you know, the kind of work that you all are doing in terms of civic, you know, I don't know what spaces are available for those civic conversations, but I would think that there could be some added benefits for increased use of our facility, and you know, obviously we have an interest in expanding our membership and getting the word out. So it would seem to me that there could be some, I don't know what you would call them, softer cultural benefits as well, and our own history, which you know, we're 106 years old now, and apparently you know, there were moments in our history when the congregation was quite active in civil rights movement and so forth. And, you know, I think that's an important part of our history that I don't understand. I don't know if anyone's done that work, but that would be a good addition to some of the other histories of the community. I'd like to know what role we played. So.
Absolutely.
So how might this play out, Peter? So if it comes before council in January, do you want to talk just a little bit about the process? That, I mean, I know that this is kind of new.
Yeah, we're still not exactly sure what Gina had in mind in terms of her desired outcome when it goes to council. And again, what I mean by that is that it seems to me that the options that council would have would be to vote at that time to what we would call initiate the application or the designation. And that would mean that council has said, yes, we're going to do this and start the process, in the sense of telling staff, start the process. Another alternative would be, and this oftentimes happens with, if you want to call it, new items that kind of come up to city council, is that council will discuss it further. And the way they typically do that is to have one of the city council subcommittees look at it. Like many other items that come to council, it would go to a subcommittee, the subcommittee would look at it and then make a recommendation back to the full city council to take further action. So if that took place, that would mean it would get scheduled on one of the council subcommittees. We would hope that that subcommittee then would, you know, look at it and make a recommendation back to the whole council to initiate landmarking. what I have labeled as what I think of the third option is, instead of the matter going to a council subcommittee, council could refer it to the city's preservation commission and kind of ask the city's preservation commission to undertake that discussion, look at the neighborhood, and send city council back a recommendation whether council should start the designation process or not. We've had a number of conversations with Gina. I think we're still a little unclear what her intent was. I believe she wanted to discuss those options with Derek Kilborn, city staff, a bit further. So I think that's still maybe a little bit up in the air. We are still waiting for confirmation that it will go back on the January agenda. I can tell you that council has a meeting next week. It is not on that first January council agenda, but we're hoping it will be on one of the council meetings later in the month. Once the process is initiated, or let's assume that the city council agrees to do so, then there will be a number of neighborhood meetings that staff would schedule, invite the neighborhood and other members of the public to come to learn more about the potential district process. And then staff would undertake doing the actual application itself. Once the application is completed, there is a public hearing in front of the Preservation Commission. The commission provides a recommendation again back to City Council, and then the final step in that process is for City Council to vote on the application with another public hearing. In theory, once an application is complete, it is supposed to be heard by the commission within 60 days, and the council hearing after commission action is supposed to take place again within 60 days. I say in theory because sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. The long and short of it is, like anything else, if it's going to happen, I think it requires, ongoing kind of public push and support to make sure it happens in a timely fashion. So even if council voted to initiate the district, I still think there'll be a need for us to make sure that staff gets to it in a timely fashion, and the process moves forward. So those are the very basic steps. So long and short, you're talking about a multi-month process at a minimum.
Well, this is,
would it need public input from our church? Because our church would have to be able to vote on it. I mean, we couldn't take a unilateral decision unless we had a proper vote to proceed. But
Right.
It seems like it would be helpful to have some backing.
It would. I think that part of certainly local politics, I don't think has changed over the decades.
Yeah.
The more support that City Council hears for it, the better off it will be. I mean, I would expect there'll be some opposition, and when I say some opposition, I would just imagine there's going to be some property owners who say, no, we don't want this. Clearly, public support is one piece of kind of making that or reaching that successful outcome of district designation.
yeah, it's a really good point. I think we need to have some discussion about that.
So, and the easiest on that would be our congregational meeting in May. I mean, we could do it at any time, but so that would be something for consideration in terms of timeline, something that's already baked into our calendar.
Yeah, I think May would clearly be timely. I mean, it's not going to be done before that, so that would be good timing wise.
Is that the mechanism you're thinking about, Sally?
Yes, but the approval of the group, and
Right.
there'd have to be some education, of course.
Right.
So Peter would have to come back.
Well, I think there'll be opportunities for us to hear from city staff once the process starts. They'll, like Peter said, they'll be doing presentations, and we can certainly have a presence at those meetings, and just hear the conversation.
Yes, come in.
Right, and just,
You have to leave.
as far as, preserve the burg, again, and we typically we'll do our efforts to try and push that along. So through our communication channels, e-newsletter, our kind of social media, our website, et cetera, we would, do that as well.
Right. Well, this has been really helpful. We appreciate it, and happy to have it recorded so others can listen in. But we'll look for just to kind of I'll keep us in the loop, and I'll be attentive to council actions if there are actions next month. So, and Michael is our board president, so he can decide, how we want to have the internal conversations. So,
And you're on the preservation committee.
yeah, I'm on the Planning and Preservation Commission. Yeah. I mean, this would not come to us until late, and
But it would be
I assume,
helpful.
but it might come to us early. So.
Okay.
All right,
Well, we very much appreciate you joining us and your willingness to, listen and to the story that, we have to tell about the appreciation for historic preservation and our history, city's history. I often think of Mirror Lake as kind of the original civic center of our city. So it has a really important, I think, history to be preserved. So we thank you all for being, so attentive and willing to listen. So thank you.
yeah,
you.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.